A trembling boy's voice broke through the roar of an arena in 1972. Thousands froze, thinking security would silence him. But Elvis Presley stopped cold on stage, eyes fixed on the sound. What unfolded next turned a rock concert into a moment that no one in the building ever forgot. Las Vegas Hilton, November 1972. The showroom was bathed in golden light. More than 2,000 fans filled every seat, their excitement humming like electricity in the air. Spotlights burned across the stage, catching the rhinestones on Elvis Presley's white jumpsuit, the red scarf draped around his neck. The orchestra began the familiar opening of You Gave Me a Mountain. Joe Guercio, the conductor, raised his baton with practiced grace. Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice warm, steady, filling the room. The crowd swayed together, cameras flashing like fireflies. Waitresses rushed between tables, setting down drinks, but even the clink of glasses was drowned beneath the power of his song. Then it happened. A single voice cut through the harmony. Elvis! The sound was not a cheer. It was not a fan's excited scream. It was a cry, high and broken, like glass shattering against stone. The orchestra faltered. Joe Guercio glanced sideways, waiting for a signal. Elvis's brow furrowed. The boy's voice came again, this time heavy with sobs. Elvis! Please! Heads turned toward the balcony. A ripple passed through the audience, whispers rising and falling like waves. Some fans looked annoyed. Others leaned forward, eyes searching the dark rows above. Elvis stood still at center stage, microphone lowered. The room seemed to shrink around that sound. Imagine being there. Do you silence the moment, or do you let it change everything? The boy's sob carried once more. Stronger, more desperate. Elvis. Help! The tension was unbearable. The Hilton showroom, built for perfection, was suddenly shaken by chaos, and the king of rock and roll had not yet made his choice. The sobbing voice did not stop. It grew sharper, more painful, as if each word was being torn out of the boy's chest. Elvis! The crowd murmured nervously. Some clutched their programs tighter. Others shook their heads. This was Las Vegas, not a small-town fair. The Hilton showroom was famous for order, for elegance. Disruptions were rare and never tolerated. Two ushers moved quickly toward the balcony. Their suits were pressed, their expressions stern. The Hilton valued control above all else. Nothing could be allowed to break the spell of the performance. Joe Guercio gave a hesitant nod to the orchestra, trying to press forward with the song. A trumpet blared, then faltered. The players glanced toward Elvis, waiting. Should they drown out the noise or fall silent? Elvis looked up. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in focus. He heard something more than noise. He heard grief. The crowd shifted again. Some clapped lightly, urging him to continue. Others whispered, "What's happening?" Cameras flashed nervously, capturing images of the king frozen mid-song. The boy cried once more. This time it came like thunder in a quiet church. "Elvis, please! It's for my dad!" The words cracked open the room. Even the ushers hesitated. The conductor's baton dropped to his side. The band stopped completely. A silence fell heavier than any ovation. Elvis raised one hand, stopping the ushers in their tracks. Gasps echoed. Was he really about to acknowledge the disruption? No one expected it. The Hilton prided itself on polished perfection, on never letting a moment spin out of control. But Elvis was not like other performers. The boy's voice broke once more, softer now, swallowed by tears. "My dad loved your songs." And then, only the sound of someone weeping in the shadows. What would you have done standing in Elvis's place? Would you ignore it, protect the show, or step into the unknown? Elvis lowered the microphone. The next choice he made would decide the night. The Hilton showroom had never felt so tense. 2,000 people sat in velvet chairs, their bodies frozen between excitement and unease. This was supposed to be flawless entertainment, a polished jewel of Las Vegas nightlife. Instead, the air felt like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. The ushers lingered near the balcony, uncertain. They had their orders: remove disruptions quickly, restore silence. Yet Elvis's raised hand had stopped them mid-step. That single gesture carried more weight than any rulebook. The boy's sobs echoed in the hush, raw and human. Guests glanced at one another. A woman in the front row whispered, "What's happening?" A man near the bar muttered, "He should just keep singing." But Elvis did not sing. He stared upward, his face unreadable. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but he didn't. The crowd leaned closer, holding their breath. Joe Guercio tapped his baton against the stand, uncertain whether to continue. The orchestra remained still. The Hilton was a place where timing mattered to the second. Yet now, time itself seemed to stop. The stakes stretched higher with every passing moment. If Elvis ignored the boy, the ushers would drag him out. The show would roll forward, polished as ever. But something would be broken. A memory would linger, sour and unspoken. If he acknowledged the cry, the performance could spiral into chaos. The carefully planned set list would be ruined. Paying fans might turn angry, demanding the show they had travelled for. The Hilton management would not approve. It was a choice between safety and risk, between order and compassion. The boy's voice cracked again, softer but still carrying. "Please, Elvis, for my dad." Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. A few looked away, embarrassed by the intimacy of the moment. Others leaned forward, sensing they were on the edge of something rare. And still, Elvis remained motionless. The seconds dragged. His silence screamed louder than any lyric. What does it mean to be an artist? To perform only for applause, or to see the hidden ache in the crowd and answer it? Security waited for his signal. The audience held its collective breath. The boy's sobs trembled through the golden-lit hall. Elvis finally lowered his gaze. His jaw set. Something had shifted in his eyes. The next move would not just decide the concert. It would decide what kind of legend he truly was. The silence was unbearable. 2,000 people sat in stillness, every eye locked on Elvis Presley. The boy's cries trembled in the balcony, echoing like thunder across a canyon. Security waited for a signal. The orchestra clutched their instruments, frozen. And then Elvis did something no one expected. He lowered his microphone. His voice, soft and steady, cut through the heavy quiet. "Where's the little fella?" Gasps rippled across the room. The ushers halted. Some fans clutched their pearls. Others turned in their seats to search for the boy. The spotlight operator hesitated, then slowly shifted the beam upward, sweeping across the balcony rows. There he was, a boy, no more than 10 years old, his cheeks streaked with tears, his small hands clutching a wrinkled photograph. His shoulders shook as he tried to call again, but the sound collapsed into sobs. Elvis pointed gently. "Him! Bring him down here!" The room erupted in whispers. This was not in the script. No performer, especially not in Las Vegas, ever stopped a Hilton show. Yet Elvis had frozen everything for one boy. The ushers climbed the stairs, not to remove him, but to guide him down. The crowd parted like water as the boy was led through the aisles. The murmur of voices grew louder. What was Elvis doing? The boy's steps faltered as he neared the stage. His small frame looked fragile beneath the glare of the lights. Elvis crouched down on one knee, holding out his hand. The orchestra remained silent. Even the air seemed to pause. When the boy reached the stage, Elvis leaned close. His words weren't for the crowd, but for the child alone. "What's your name, son?" The boy whispered something through his tears. Only those closest heard. "Michael." "And what do you have there?" Elvis nodded at the crumpled photo. The boy lifted it with trembling fingers. "My dad, he loved you. He's gone now." The words cracked like lightning. A collective gasp filled the Hilton showroom. Strangers held their breath, their hearts breaking in unison. Elvis placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his eyes shining. For the first time all night, the king of rock and roll looked less like a star and more like a father. Few artists ever dared to break the script. Why did Elvis? Because sometimes music is not enough. Sometimes the heart demands more. The boy stood trembling beside Elvis Presley, his small hand clutching the crumpled photograph. The spotlight bathed them both in white fire. Around them, 2,000 strangers sat hushed, waiting to see what would happen next. Elvis gently removed the red scarf from his neck. The fabric shimmered beneath the lights. With a tenderness that startled everyone, He draped it over the boy's shoulders. The child's sobs slowed. His wide eyes lifted to meet Elvis's. The microphone crackled as Elvis spoke again, his voice quiet but strong. "This little man's daddy isn't here tonight, but his spirit sure is." A murmur swept the room. Some guests pressed tissues to their eyes. Others clasped hands as if in church. It was no longer a showroom. It was something deeper, something sacred. The boy whispered again, words the front row barely caught. "He used to sing your songs." Elvis nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then tonight, we'll sing for him." He rose slowly to his feet, keeping one hand on the child's shoulder. He turned to Joe Guercio, who stood frozen at the conductor's podium. Elvis gave a single nod. The orchestra stirred back to life. Soft chords filled the air, tender and restrained. Elvis raised the microphone and began again. Not the set list, not the polished Vegas routine, but something raw, from the core of his soul. The first words trembled with emotion. His voice cracked slightly, then steadied, carried by a strength deeper than performance. As he sang, the boy clutched the scarf tighter, staring upward with tears still shining on his face. The crowd leaned in, their own breaths uneven. For those minutes, no one thought of sequins, lights, or tickets. They thought of fathers gone, of families missing pieces, of the weight that music sometimes lifts for us. The Hilton showroom, designed for spectacle, was transformed into a sanctuary. Strangers cried quietly in their seats. Couples held hands tighter. Some closed their eyes, whispering their own names of loved ones. Elvis poured himself into every lyric, his gaze drifting often to the boy by his side. His voice rose, strong and trembling with truth. When the final note hung in the air, silence gripped the room. It was not the usual silence before applause. It was reverence, as if no one dared to break the spell. Then, all at once, the audience erupted. Cheers crashed like waves. Some stood, clapping furiously. Others wept openly, unable to contain themselves. The boy turned toward Elvis, lips trembling as if to speak. Elvis knelt once more, pulling him into an embrace. For a moment, the child disappeared into the arms of the king, and the crowd, 2,000 souls, felt the same embrace through that gesture. Have you ever seen music turn into medicine? That night, they all did. In the years that followed, whispers of that Hilton night traveled far beyond Las Vegas. Bootleg cassette tapes, recorded secretly by fans, captured the silence, the sobs, and the moment Elvis's voice cracked with compassion, those tapes passed hand to hand, became treasures in fan clubs across America. Newspapers hinted at the story. A brief line in the Las Vegas Sun, November 1972, read, "Elvis paused mid-show for a child's plea, stunning the crowd. But the truth was richer than print could hold. The boy, known only as Michael from Arizona, grew older. Decades later, a journalist traced him. He still carried that scarf, preserved behind glass, its color faded but its memory untouched. It's the only piece of my father I have left," he told them softly. Fans never forgot. They spoke of it at conventions, at tribute shows, in late-night conversations. Not every legend needs a stage or a spotlight. Some live only in the hearts of those who witness them. The Hilton itself, years later, placed a plaque in honor of Elvis's residency. It did not mention that night. Yet among fans, it became the story most often told. Why do certain moments outlive the music? Perhaps because they remind us that fame is fleeting. But compassion is eternal. The Hilton crowd left with more than a concert. They left with a story they would repeat until their final days. When people speak of Elvis Presley, they remember the jumpsuits, the sold-out shows, the thunder of his voice. But those who sat inside the Hilton in November 1972 carried something different. They remembered a man who stopped everything to hear the cry of a child. It wasn't the notes that night that mattered most. It wasn't the bright lights or the famous stage. It was the pause, the decision to reach for a small hand trembling in the dark. Greatness is often measured by records sold or crowds counted. Yet true greatness is measured by moments like these, when a legend chooses humanity over perfection. Elvis showed that night that music is more than entertainment. It can be a bridge, a comfort, a way of holding someone's grief when they cannot carry it alone. The boy left with a scarf around his shoulders, the crowd left with tears in their eyes, and Elvis left having proven that compassion is the strongest note of all. Sometimes, the most unforgettable echoes are born not from applause, but from silence answered with kindness. This story reminds us that one act of compassion can outlast a lifetime of performances. If you were in that Hilton crowd, how would you remember it today? Share this with someone who believes in the power of kindness, and explore more untold moments that shaped the legend of Elvis Presley.